Hey gang, we're just going to do a quick little discussion here about survey design. Um, so starting off with just a little vocabulary, we want to talk about populations versus samples. So a population is when we're talking about the entire group that we want to learn about. So the population could be all Kettle Moraine High School students, or it could be all people in the state of Wisconsin. Okay? All people living in the US. Okay, so our population could take different sizes depending on what we're interested in. Um, Measuring everyone in the population is called taking a census. And actually, this year we have that going on again, 2020 census, where they're trying to collect data on every single person in the United States. So they're trying to measure everyone in the population. And when we talk about populations and we come up with numerical summaries like the mean and the standard deviation of a population, that's called a parameter. And we're going to talk more about parameters a little bit later. But for right now, parameters are the numerical summaries that we use for populations. On the flip side of that, we could take a sample of a population. So a sample is a subset, a smaller group from your population. Okay, so if my population is residents of Wisconsin, then my sample should only include people from Wisconsin. Okay? However, if my population is all people in the United States, then my sample should include people from throughout the United States and not just from Wisconsin. And when we talk about numerical summaries of a sample, so if I find the mean of our sample, that's called a statistic. Now, one thing that I find easy to help me remember where parameters and statistics go, parameters in population P, statistics and samples both start with S. Okay, so if you're finding information from a population, the entire group, that's a parameter. If you're calculating numerical summaries for a sample, for part of the population, so a sample of your population, that's a statistic. One thing when we're collecting data from a sample of people that we have to be careful about is bias in survey questions. Okay, so a survey is one way to collect data about a sample of data. When we talk about bias in survey questions, we're talking about, for the most part, how are they worded? Okay? So one way they could be biased is in the question order. So depending on what order you ask people the questions, that may change how they respond to the questions. And so a lot of times it's good if you design a survey to have multiple forms of that survey where the questions show up in different orders, unless it doesn't make sense, obviously, for the questions to show up in different orders. But if the questions can show up in different orders, it may be better to have them do that on different forms of the surveys so that you know that the answer to one question isn't going to influence people's answer to another question. Okay? Prefacing something. So we might start a question with a statement that could bias the results. So here's an example. 3 servings of vegetables a day are recommended for a healthy lifestyle. How many servings of vegetables do you eat a day? That statement right before the question tells you that if you don't answer that question with 3 or more, that maybe you're not healthy. And people don't want to be seen as unhealthy. And so they may change their answers slightly because of that sentence that came before the question. Okay? This question would be better if it was just left with the actual question portion. How many servings of vegetables do you eat a day? Okay? That's going to allow people to answer more honestly. Another one is if we ask 2 questions in one. So, for example, do you agree with reducing the school day and starting school earlier? Well, that's 2 separate questions. I may be in favor of reducing the number of hours that we're in school, but I might not like to get up early. So I might not want to start school earlier. So I agree with the first half, but I don't agree with the second half. And so if I'm only allowed to give one answer here, yes, I agree or I disagree, um, my answer doesn't truly represent how I feel about both parts of the question. And so there's bias here. This question would be better if it was just two separate questions. Do you think we should reduce the school day? Do you think we should start school earlier? Two separate questions. Then we have biased wording. So this would be using pleasant or unpleasant words to influence the results. So, for example, do you think the gruesome and disturbing violence in video games has a negative effect on children exposed to them? Okay. By using words like gruesome and disturbing, okay, you're influencing the respondents. Okay? You're putting these negative images into their minds and you're influencing them to answer in a particular way. Okay? So you want to avoid using positive or negative words, adjectives in particular, that might influence the results. So what you could say is, do you think video games have a positive or negative effect on children exposed to them? Okay? Or what effect do you think video games have on children? Okay? Now, the more open-ended you leave it, the more possible variety of results you're going to get from your respondents. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to sort of bring all of your data together. But by making questions open-ended, you also leave less influence on your part. So you have to find that balancing act between how much do I just want to give them a multiple choice, A, B, C, D, and they have to pick one of these responses, in which case, depending on how I word the responses with the question, I may influence their results some, or do I want to leave the question as open as possible, but then it's going to be harder for me to bring all of my data together. Okay. And the last thing is this desire to please. So if you think about who's asking the question, okay, if we've got our school referendum coming up in the election and we send students out to poll the public and ask them if they're in favor of the referendum passing. Well, people may be more likely to say yes, they are, if they know that you're a student at the school because they don't want to disappoint you. Okay? If your doctor asks you how many times you're exercising, okay, well, your doctor is the one that's judging your health. And so you may want to exaggerate a little bit and say you're exercising more than you are because maybe you're ashamed that you're not exercising as much as you should be. Okay? I know I do this sometimes when I'm at the vet with my dog and they ask how much we're feeding the dog and I get embarrassed because maybe we're giving the dog too many treats. And so I may not respond accurately to that because of my desire to please the veterinarian. So so you have to be careful about this desire to please. Oftentimes, anonymous surveys may be better if you want to try to avoid that desire to please. So we'll be talking more about surveys and sampling. How do we collect data? Who do we choose to collect the data from? How do we make sure we have a sample that is representative of our population? And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit more about as we move forward.